Kristen Atchison here, and we're finishing our discussion of intelligence. So, one of the theories that we have of intelligence is Sternberg's triarchic theory of successful intelligence. And as the name suggests, triarchic, Sternberg says that there was three important components to being having a successful intelligence. One of which is analytical skills. That includes those kind of information processing skills. Another one was creative, the capacity to solve these novel problems. And the third was practical. This is kind of that street smarts, the ability to apply that intellect in everyday situations. And Sternberg said for really there to be successful intelligence, it met in the middle of these three things. So that you needed that analytical intelligence, the ability to apply strategies, to engage in self-regulation. You need that practical intelligence, that adaptability, to select environments to reach your goals, to deal with the demands of your environments. You need creative intelligence to be able to solve these novel problems, kind of make those other processing skills automatic so we free up space for higher cognition and complex thought. And so Sternberg said that really to have the successful intelligence, you needed all three of these components. Another theory of intelligence comes from Howard Gardner. And he's looking at multiple intelligence. So when we think of intelligence, typically we kind of think of school smarts, okay? We think about, in fact, most of the kinds of tests look at things that are related to learning and education. What Howard Gardner is saying is that that's really too narrow of a view of intelligence, that there really is kind of a diverse field of intelligence. And he says that these are distinct processing operations that permit people to engage in a wide range of valued activities. He dismisses this idea of general IQ. He instead says that there's subcategories, which are linguistic, logomathematical, musical, spatial, bodily kinesthetic, naturalist, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. And again, there's an activity on Launchpad that will allow you to kind of work through these. But here's kind of examples of those. So linguistic is word smart. Are you good with words? Do you understand word meanings? Can you manipulate words? A really good example of someone that would have been high on Howard Gardner's scale of linguistic intelligence would be writers. Okay, so Toni Morrison, any writer you can think of is going to be high on that linguistic scale, on Howard Gardner's linguistic scale of intelligence. Logical mathematical is that number smart. So mathematicians, engineers, scientists, that's where we're going to see a lot of really people that are scoring high on Gardner's logical mathematical. So Albert Einstein's a perfect example. Music smart. So any kind of, musicians, especially musicians that really have diverse skills such as writing and composing and performing, especially multiple instruments like the Marsalis families do. So that's something that really has a lot of musical skills. Spatial is art smart. So are they able to kind of manipulate their hands and the space and understand how these things all work together to create something different? An example would be any famous artist, but Pablo Picasso. He would have scored high on Gardner's art smart or spatial intelligence. Bodily kinesthetic, body smart. Can you manipulate your body in many different ways? So again, an example would be any top athlete, Tiger Woods, any top basketball players. So, we're March Madness right now. So, the people that are top performing when we get to the Final Four, those are people that would score high on Howard Gardner's bodily kinesthetic intelligence. Intrapersonal, that's about how you are able to kind of view yourself. So intra means kind of looking in. And so as much as we all know how I feel about Sigmund Freud, he was very good at looking inside, that introspection, able to reflect on themselves. We've all met that person that doesn't have a lot of self-awareness. That would be somebody that doesn't score high on the intrapersonal intelligence. But again, this interpersonal is kind of being able to kind of look inside oneself, that self-awareness, that introspection, those kinds of skills. And that's opposed to interpersonal, and that's kind of that relationships between people. So people smart, understanding how other people work, how those relationships work. I mean, we see really dynamic leaders like Mahatma Gandhi really would be high scorers on this interpersonal because they understand relationships between people, they understand other people, they understand how kind of people work. And the final category we have is naturalist or nature smart. People like John Audubon, who was the Audubon Society is named after, John Muir, anybody who really had a really understanding of how nature works and how it's interconnected, and understands that kind of more that ecosystem view, that it's not just one thing, it's this grander thing. It's going to be something that's going to be scoring high on Gardner's naturalist aptitude. So again, these are just different theories that are looking at kind of what intelligence is. Regardless of what intelligence is, where is intelligence coming from? Is it coming from these genetic factors, or is it coming from these environmental influences? So we're back to our nature-nurture debate that we started kind of the semester with. So again, heritability is referring to that proportion that's due to genetic variance, okay? And again, we study these things by twin studies primarily. We just had a great twin study in the news that looked at heritability. The Kelly brothers, both astronauts, one of which spent a year in space, the other of which spent a year here, identical twins. And they took a lot of data, a lot of medical data specifically on both of these individuals to look at the effects of space on aging, to look at the effects of extended radiation on the body, these things. And so again, twin studies will let us look at these things. So to study the genetic and environmental influences of intelligence, one way we do that is twin studies. We can also look in family members, and we do this with adoption studies too. Again, there's an online Launchpad assignment that kind of walks you through some of the differences we see in heritability and the role of environmental influences. So make sure you do that. It really is a nice thing that demonstrates the differences between twins, reared together, reared apart, siblings, reared together, reared apart, and the role of both genetics and environment in the outcome. Currently, what we're seeing is that genetics account for some difference, and the environment is playing a role too. It's just there's a disagreement about how much of a role the environment is playing. But what we do see from these adoption studies and these twin studies is that both genetics and environment are playing a role. We see children with a study that looked at children with biological mothers that had an IQ of less than 95 and children with biological mothers that had an IQ above 20. And these are both adopted children. And so we had a lower IQ biological group and a higher IQ biological group. And they were being adopted into families that were really very similar. They were above average income, above average education, and they had similar kinds of IQ as well. So we had these two genetic differences, but we had a similar environment. And what we found is that the low kids still scored above average IQ, but they didn't do as well as the high IQ kids. So these kids that had been kind of genetically predisposed for a low IQ actually scored above average. So that indicates that there's a role that environment is playing. However, these high IQ kids who were genetically predisposed to be high IQ when raised in this supportive environment still had high IQ, and they still were higher than these low IQ kids. So again, we see that both are playing a role, and it just is kind of an interplay between them. Adoption studies have found that children's IQ are more similar to their biological parents. So again, just like in that last example, the high IQ kids stayed high IQ. And the low IQ kids improved, but they were still lower IQ than the high IQ kids. So that, again, that genetics is playing a role. And this average IQ typically falls between 105 and 110. Adopted children tend to have above average IQs, though. They tend to have an IQ that's above 105 and 110. And again, if you think about who is adopting children, these are kind of going to be more supportive environments. They're going to be more financially secure. They're going to be likely more highly educated. So they're going to have this more supportive, this more, in some ways, beneficial environment because they have more resources available to them. And so adopted children tend to still have high above average IQs because of this role of environment. But again, the twin studies are supporting this evidence for biological influence. So kind of think of it as biology is kind of setting a range of where that IQ can fall. And then the environment dictates, well, within that range set by genes, are we going to be on the top end of that range, or are we going to be at the bottom end of that range, or are we in the middle of that range? And again, environment's allowing us to kind of move within that range that's set by biology. So here's a graph that kind of sums up these findings. Again, this is an interactive thing as well on Launchpad, so I highly encourage you to go and interact with that. But we see that when you combine environment and genetics, so identical twins in the same environment, we have the highest similarity, where when we take out genetics as a whole, we take out unrelated individuals, we have the lowest. So again, genetics are really setting the stage, and environment is saying, okay, well, given the genetics, given what we've got, where can we go with this? Are we going to go up? Are we going to go down? But again, genetics is kind of setting that stage. So the conclusion, again, is that intelligence is this complex interaction between heredity and the environment. And again, genetics is usually telling the environment, okay, here's where you can play with, okay? You can go from here to here. This is kind of your genetic range, and environment will typically dictate where and that is. Currently, the estimate we have for heritability within the population is about 50%. So again, that's allowing a lot of room for genetic influences. Again, other things that influence performance on IQ tests, which is again our primary way that we measure intelligence, is the influence of the environment. So we see the socioeconomic status of the families playing a role. So when we saw those rises in IQ scores with adopted children, that's because the SES of the family was typically higher. Socioeconomic status takes into account income, it takes into account education, and it takes into account status of kind of the job, those sorts of things. And so all of those things with a higher SES score usually equates to more resources available in the environment. We also see that different values among cultures can really influence IQ scores as well. So environment is definitely playing a role with what the tools genetics is giving. We see that early neglect from caregivers can really be a detriment. So we can have early intervention, and that's very, very helpful, or we can have neglect, and it can be detrimental. So some studies looked at Romanian orphans, and these orphanages were just heinous. These children were left in cribs on their backs. There was very little human interaction, very little stimulation. These environments had little to no resources. And what we saw is really dramatic decreases in IQ. We saw lots of delays in development, which later translated to these IQ deficits. We see, however, that we can have early intervention effects. I just read a study today that taught mothers in 3 countries, I think one of which was Zimbabwe, when their babies were 3 months to 3 years, they came once to twice a week, and they taught them skills about interacting with their kids. And these were really low income families. And they were taught skills about kind of how to playfully interact, how to engage with them, really how to create this good environment. And what they saw is by the time that these kids were 3, they had caught up to the kids that had the good environment from the get-go. Okay, so early intervention can play a big role. Whether we have good care from the beginning, whether we don't, really dictates a lot of what's going on. These Romanian orphans, when they got intervention, a lot of them were able to catch up. If they had a really long period of time before they got intervention, some of these things that couldn't be caught up. So we really see that there are some critical periods for the role of interaction and supportive environments and how that influences IQ. Another thing that we see is that schooling correlates with higher intelligence scores, higher IQ scores. So the longer you go to school, the higher your IQ scores are. Some of that they think has to do, again, with environment and the biases in the test. These tests are set up to be not purposely, but asking questions that are more knowledge-based, asking questions in formats where you get an advantage if you've gone to school for a longer period of time. And so to increase the readiness for schoolwork, to kind of, again, facilitate this environment, this role of environment and on IQ, there's programs like Head Start. Georgia's a really great example too, because Georgia offers free pre-K through the Georgia Lottery to everyone. So these are, again, good examples of that adaptive, that supportive educational environment having good outcomes. The Abecedarian project is similar to that study that I was talking about with like teaching the parents. And again, they were going into low income, low resource environments, family environments, and they were providing the resources that these kids didn't have, whether that was interaction, whether that was books, and the outcomes that they had for these kids of the Abecedarian project was really, really interesting. So I encourage you to go to that website. The YouTube video is linked on our YouTube watch list, so I encourage you to look at that too. Very, very interesting stuff to look at. Other things that we see influence performance on IQ tests, we see that racial and ethnic groups tend to differ in terms of IQ scores. No one will ever attest to that being anything to do with genetics. What we see is that typically is reflective of biases in these tests. That these tests are written typically by the majority group, and so they are not always reflective of minority experiences. And so we see that can be problematic. You can't necessarily take an IQ test from the United States and give it in Indonesia because those cultures are very, very different. That test was written for an environment, and Indonesia is a very different environment than the United States. So typically these tests are very culturally specific. And so even when we see within our majority culture, there are subcultures, and we can see differences between that. We see more variation existing within a group than between groups, okay? So while we do see differences between groups, ethnic groups, or racial groups, or cultural groups, where we see the most difference is within that group, okay? So we still have more variation within a group than we have between groups. The possible causes of this, again, genetics is not at play here. This has nothing to do with any kind of genetic outcome. What we do see is, again, these environmental influences can support this. So when all those intervention studies we were just talking about, this supportive environment really plays a role. So there's a lot of support for the role of environment because sometimes we see differences in minority groups and socioeconomic status. When we see differences in racial groups and that correlates with socioeconomic status, a lot of times those correlates also translate to these differences in IQ score. So again, largely, perhaps entirely responsible for some of these group differences. Another thing that we see is, again, these cultural biases in the test. There's different communication styles in different cultures, in different racial and ethnic groups, that the test may not be reflective of. So again, you're asking a child or an adult to answer a question that's in a very different communication style than they're used to, which doesn't set that person up for success. Another thing that we see at play is stereotype threat, and I'll spend some more time on another slide talking to you about that. So again, this idea of cultural bias in the testing. One view says, nope, the tests aren't biased. They represent success in the common culture. And so that cultural factors can kind of hurt these test performances, these communication styles, these test content, these stereotypes. However, what we really know is, again, that the cultural factors are a problem, okay? So these tests that really are biased because because they are written by this common culture, and this common culture is not always universal, especially in countries that are very diverse, and in areas that are very diverse. These differences in communication styles, these differences in test content, and the stereotypes that go along with tests and individual racial and ethnic groups. So again, most people now agree that these IQ tests do have biases, and many attempts have been made to make less biased tests, to some success, but again, they're tests being written by people of one culture trying to test, people of often a different culture. And so there are, always going to be some of that in there. Other things that affect performance on IQ tests are these cultural biases, these stereotype threats. So stereotype threat is the fear of being judged based on a negative stereotype, okay? So this can be women, African Americans, can be any cultural group, any gender group, really any stereotype for any group can have stereotype effects. So this is a study that looked at ethnic group. So it took African American, Hispanic American, Caucasian American children. And they took a test. It was a verbal test, and they were told either one of two things. So this was an experiment, and half the kids in each of these ethnic groups were told, this is not a test, okay? And then the other half of the kids were told, this is a test of how good you are at school problems. And what we saw is that results on the performance of that test really reflected the stereotype for that ethnic group. So when Hispanic and African American children were told this was a test of performance on school problems, they scored poorer than when they were told that this was not a test. Okay, so within those ethnic groups, they scored poorer when it was told this is a test of school problems versus not. When the Caucasian American children were told this is not a test versus how good they are at school problems, they actually got a little bit of a boost being told that this was a test of how good you are at school problems. That stereotype for that cultural group actually gave a slight benefit. Whether it was significant or not, it's not clear from this graph, but it gave a slight boost. When you compare the test of how good you are at school problems between the two ethnic groups, you see a dramatic difference. So if you look at those two yellow lines, that's a pretty dramatic difference, 60% to 100%. So again, we're seeing that the stereotype threat can account for a lot of the differences that we're seeing in some of these IQ test scores. So again, no psychologist today is going to say, yeah, there's any kind of genetic component, because there's not. The question is, why are there differences? Again, these cultural biases, these stereotypes are all likely factors, as is, again, the role of environment that children are being presented in. Again, we see more differences within an individual ethnic and racial group than we see between different groups. So again, what differences we are seeing aren't great, but they are there, and it's our job to kind of figure out why. Thanks, and see you in class.